Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to just jump right in and we're going to be focusing on media, social media, and terrorism. And this, I think, is a particularly interesting lecture to really start to think about a lot of the various components of the way that we think about the role of terrorism as a communication strategy and the importance of media for terrorism. So let's jump right in. Well, we've always emphasized since the beginning of class when we talked about and started looking at definitions of terrorism that terrorism is a communication strategy, right? We've always talked about the fact that terrorism isn't just about the particular attack that's carried out, right? It's about the broader message that the group is trying to achieve. But how do they achieve their broader message? Well, they need the media to achieve this goal. And so we're going to look at the fact that in many ways, the relationship between media and terrorism is cyclical. And so I think thinking about these two questions that we're going to really try to dig into about the broader relationship of media and terrorism will highlight this cyclical relationship. And we can think about it in two ways. One, how does the media influence terrorists? But also we have to think about how do terrorists influence the media? So let's dig into this first question, try to get an understanding of the cyclical relationship and how this plays such an important role in terrorism. So, how does the media influence terrorists? Well, first of all, we think about the media as the gateway of information for the masses, right? How do we all come to know about what's happening in the world? We consume media, whether it's print, whether it's television, whether it's on the internet. Media is the way we gain information about what's happening in the world. And with the extensive amount of information out there and that the media provides, this is what terrorists can use to communicate their particular message, whether it's religious terrorism, politically motivated terrorism, racially motivated, ethnically motivated terrorism. They all need the media, right, to serve as their gateway to communicate their particular message. So that's how we have to think about it right off the bat in terms of the media's connection to influencing terrorists, right? We think about their ability to influence terrorists as well as the terrorist influence media. But first, we're going to dig into particular ways that the media can influence terrorists. And one of those is it's been found in certain studies that the media can actually influence the frequency of terrorist attacks. So there's been an extensive long-range study of Al-Qaeda since the early 2000s, and they've found that when the media focused on Al-Qaeda attacks more often, there was more likely to be subsequent Al-Qaeda attacks. So when the media, and conversely, when the media focused less on attacks that Al-Qaeda committed, there were fewer subsequent Al-Qaeda attacks. So whenever there were major news events that shifted the focus away from terrorism, and particularly terrorism that Al-Qaeda had committed, we saw a decrease in attacks. This was something that was noted after, say, the Hurricane Katrina, when the media was focused on a natural disaster like that in 2005, the number of Al-Qaeda attacks actually decreased. Similar thing happened in 2008 with the financial crisis. So interestingly, the media seems to have the capacity to influence in some ways the frequency of terrorist attacks by the amount of coverage it gives those particular incidents. And then we can also see that the media can play an important role in shaping the public's perceptions of terrorism. One interesting study that really has highlighted this, especially shows how we think about terrorism in the United States, and we think about who perpetrates terrorism. So a lot of studies have shown Americans are far more concerned about Islamically motivated terrorism than far-right and white supremacist motivated terrorism. But if we look at the statistical numbers from 2008 to 2015, in that period, there were only 63 attempted plots of Islamically motivated terrorism targeted towards the United States. And so, of course, not all of these were actually carried out. A lot of them were foiled beforehand. And during the same period, there were 115 right-wing plots. But what we found is, in a lot of analysis of terrorist attacks, is that terrorist attacks that are committed by Islamically motivated terrorists get 4.5 times as much coverage as any other type of terrorist group or ideology behind any particular type of terrorism. So the media can play an important role in shaping how people perceive terrorism, who's involved with it, and can be very different from the actual statistics and numbers on who's engaging in terrorism, who's carrying out these attacks. So there's something to think about how the media can shape and influence terrorists and then public opinion about terrorism. And then we also have to think about how terrorists influence the media. So terrorists are not simply responsive to what the media says. Terrorists will try to create their own narrative and try to influence the media to gain greater coverage and greater focus on their particular causes. So how do they do this? Well, they understand that media needs ratings, right? Particularly television audiences. Cable news, local news, all of these things are driven in many ways by their ratings. They need ratings because they have to have more people watching so they can charge more money for advertising revenues and to continue to make more money. So terrorists understand that the media needs incidents that are going to attract eyeballs, that are going to make people stay engaged, and they understand that by committing terrorist attacks, the media is going to probably focus extensively on their particular actions. And why is that? Well, an old TV news expression goes, if it bleeds, it leads. And unfortunately, people are more willing to focus, pay attention, watch the news when particularly violent events happen. People are more engaged, they're more tuned into what's happening when particular violence occurs. And so when we think about it on larger scales, particularly shocking events like terrorist attacks, this really plays out in this idea of it bleeds, it leads, where the news media really does continue to maintain a focus on these events because they know more people are watching and paying attention. So through this, we can sort of see in some ways how the media is able to influence terrorists, but then also how terrorists are then able to play in the media. And we can have this cyclical effect that can really, in a lot of ways, achieve in some ways what terrorist groups want. They want their message out there, and they can achieve this in a lot of ways by manipulating this cyclical relationship between the media and terrorists. So this leads us to our first discussion question. So discussion question 1 is, how do you think the media should cover terrorism? So I'll repeat that. Discussion question 1. How do you think the media should cover terrorism? Okay, now let's move on to the next step. And the next topic here. And I wanted to do one more particular focus, deep dive into terrorist usage of social media, because I think this is particularly interesting. And so we can see terrorists will use social media in a lot of different ways. So how can they use it? They can use it to spread their message, right? They're able to even cut out the managers of traditional media, whether it's print with newspapers or television news, where you have editors, you have producers, people making decisions about what events are covered. Well, social media, they can get out their message without potentially being stopped by those certain roadblocks they might face if they're trying to get their message out there and they face editors or producers who aren't willing to cover or give their particular ideology attention. They can cut out that middleman by going straight to social media and spreading their particular cause. Also use it for recruitment. The next slide, we're going to dig into how they actually go about that recruitment process, which I think is particularly interesting to take a deeper dive into. But they use social media to try to increase the number of members in their particular organization. They'll also use it to try to incite attacks, even if they don't actually recruit people to join their organization. We can see this social media as a tool that they use to try to encourage others to commit attacks that further their particular goals, even if they don't ever actually join their group. They also use it for fundraising. They try to get their message out there to try to then encourage people to donate money. So this is something that ISIS has tried to do extensively, where they've tried to get individuals from around the world to send money to support their particular cause. So fundraising is a way for them to spread their message. And then they can also provide virtual training, right? They can use social media to instruct people how to make bombs, what targets to cite, what types of targets that they should focus on. So they can use virtual training to help people carry out attacks for their particular group. So let's look at this final slide here. I want to look at this process of social media recruitment, which I think is particularly interesting. So I want to look at the example of this individual guy named Zachary Chesser. This is the guy in the pictured here, and he was convicted in 2011 of providing material support to a terrorist organization, Al-Shabaab, in Somalia, and went to prison for 25 years. And he was radicalized online beginning in 2008 as a high school senior. So how do terrorist groups try to recruit people online? Well, the first thing they try to do is they try to target and find individuals they think might be receptive to their cause. And so this gets back in some ways to those psychological explanations of terrorism that we talked about way back earlier in the class, where we tried to see and understand which people might be more susceptible to joining a terrorist organization, those who feel elements of disaffection or injustice. And so they can often use social media to try to identify those particular individuals based on their posts, based on their history that they discuss online. Terrorists are able to try to locate these individuals and start to make connections with them. And so then what they'll do after they've started to make initial, perhaps public connections with them, is they'll try to shift it to private engagement. And this is where they try to start directly, privately messaging with these individuals who they targeted. They want to try to start an individual dialogue to try to start gradually introducing them to their message, bringing them into their cause. This is what Al-Shabaab did to some extent with Zachary Chesser. They reached out to him. He was interested in their particular message. They started to work him into thinking more and more about their particular ideology and their objectives. And so then what they really try to do is, once they started to get a hook into an individual, is this next step where they try to encourage isolation. They try to break this individual off from their other social connections. So they try to cut them off, encourage them to cut off family members or friends or other or teachers or other people who might be influential in their life who would not be supportive of this terrorist organization's message. They want them to really become isolated and really start to think in terms of their ultimate goal is membership in the group. So this next step, they want them to join the group. So once they've isolated them from friends, family, loved ones who might really strongly try to step in and prevent them from joining the group, this terrorist organization wants to isolate them, have them join the group, and then ultimately, once they've joined the group, begin the process of having them ultimately take action for the cause. And so this is really the way that a lot of these terrorist organizations, whether it's regardless of their particular ideology, this is a strategy used by right-wing groups, left-wing groups, all kinds of different terrorist groups have started to try to use this particular step-by-step process to increase their membership and really expand their ranks in terms of people joining their cause and using social media to do that. So, in a broader sense, this is the final discussion question, thinking about social media. So, discussion question 2 is, in what ways do you think social media has changed terrorism? Again, taking a broader look at the whole idea of social media and thinking about it more broadly, discussion question 2 is, in what ways do you think social media has changed terrorism? So